ready for takeoff.
We have our final keynote speaker today. She's a friend of the Ruby community, former COO of Travis CI, and leadership consultant and workshop facilitator. Please welcome to the stage Suzan Bond.
Let's see. Oh, am I on? I don't have to use my theater voice. Thank you for the cheer. Whoever had the cheer, thank you. Hello, thank you for the cheers. All right. So, like you said, I'm Suzan Bond, and I'm going to talk about, here's what I'm going to see. I'm going to try if I can do this without glasses, but they might go on and off. We'll see. See if I can get my eyes to see well enough. I'm going to talk about how leadership is like being lost in the wilderness. I know I'm inspiring you all to like really be supportive about leadership now, right? I promise you I'm going to give us a path out. But first, I want to talk to you about this guy. This is my dad. It's an old picture. I'm sorry for the dust. This is my dad. My dad grew up in Iowa in a really tiny town. And he was really interested in cars. He got a degree from Iowa State in mechanical engineering, and the only gig in town was John Deere. And he didn't want to work on tractors, so he and my mom got married in their senior year of college, and they took their honeymoon in Detroit, where my dad, really exotic. For them it was. My mom grew up with chickens. So she was really quite excited about it. And my dad interviewed with Chrysler, Ford, GM, and he took a job with GM. And so they moved to Detroit after they graduated from college so that my dad could work on cars. And every night at dinner, my dad, while I stuffed meatballs and spaghetti and meatloaf in my mouth, my dad would tell us about stories about how his work was. And I remember him telling me how when he would get stuck on a problem, he would have to background process. So he would stick his feet up on a chair, like on the desk and sit back. And one time his boss came by and said, "Bond." He always called him Bond. "Bond, what are you doing? Stop slacking off. Get back to work." So my dad decided, well, I can't do that. I might as well try something else. So he would then walk around the GM Tech Center, which is quite large, when he was stuck on a problem. And one day he came up with an idea. And he was half the way around the building. And so he told us how he went running back, and we laughed at the idea of my dad dodging people with big stacks of paper. This was before the internet, right? It was even before fax machines, right? We were printing papers and getting around people with coffee cups, and went back to his office. But that was the funny story. But the hard stories for me was when my dad would talk about feeling like his managers didn't understand him. So my dad worked on prototypes, electric cars that got, the first ones that were unveiled to the world at GM. He also worked on cars that got 80 miles to the gallon. We might think of my dad these days as like a senior IC, right? He wasn't interested in management, and he took a lot of crap for it. Excuse me for my language, but he took a lot of crap for it. His bosses didn't always understand him. It was a really difficult work environment. It was one of those work environments where you have to conform, and my dad did not conform. They even put him $1 beneath on the income level, beneath what the bonus pool was, because he wouldn't want to be a manager. And for me, I was always sad at these stories. And I asked my dad, was it worth it? And he said, yes. It was hard, but I loved to work on mechanical systems, and I got to advance engineering. He still tinkers with cars today. And in fact, he just built a car to race on the Salt Flats. If anybody's familiar with the Salt Flats in Utah, he was a drag racer back in the day. He's 92, almost 92, and he built a car for the Salt Flats. We're hoping to go next year. That's my dad, an unusual guy. And he said it was worth it. But for me, it always struck with me. So when I went to college, I was a music major. I was a classically trained singer, and I played 5 instruments. But I quickly decided I didn't want to perform. So I ended up studying social psychology, sociology, organizational development, leadership, and community organizing. And I've spent most of my career thinking about how to make better work environments. And only a few years ago, maybe even a year ago, I realized that I did that because I was trying to create a better environment for my dad. I wanted to time travel and go back and create a better work environment for my dad, who was doing these really cool, interesting work. And I forgot to say, he has like multiple patents. He's been on, I think this might have been a picture where he was on the cover of a magazine. He's been on a couple of covers of a couple mechanical engineering magazines, and he has a patent that for intake manifolds that multiple other patents have referenced. And I realized I want to create a better work environment for my dad. And the way that I do that is through leadership. And I know that we might think, oh, leaders, they have so much influence, and it's easy to bag on them. They make a lot of mistakes. They make a lot of mistakes. I have been one too. I made a lot of mistakes. But they have this outsized influence. And they're the biggest lever of ways that we can change our work environment. So I hope what I convince you today is why we should all really care about leadership and how we can help them be unlost, and why helping them be unlost is really, really important for all of us. So this is me. This is when I'm a COO. I don't know, I look at that and I think, look at those arrows. I must look like, look at me, look at me. But I see the doubt in my eyes. I'd had a really hard week. We'd made an unpopular decision, and I fielded a lot of folks telling me their comments about it, mostly unhappy. And I felt terrible. I felt like I was disappointing people. And I took the job so that I could create a better work environment, and here I thought, oh, I'm disappointing people. I'd had a really hard conversation with a group of people or 2 people who just couldn't get along, and I felt like a failure. And that night, I just wanted to stick my head into a bag of potato chips. Salt and vinegar, by the way, my favorite. But I didn't. Instead, I went to bed, I got a good dinner, went to bed early, and got back up again the next day to try not to stick my head into a bag of potato chips again. So, when I left being a leader, I felt the closest to burnout I'd ever felt. I've never experienced burnout, and I was pretty close. And as I reflected, I realized how lost I felt and how much I felt like I didn't know what I was doing. And I wondered, was it just me? Did the people who hired me make a big mistake and I shouldn't be a leader? Did they really make a mistake giving me that position? And so I spent the last few years talking with hundreds of leaders, interviewing them, I facilitate workshops with leaders, coaching leaders, facilitating leadership team offsites. And here's what they told me. Decision making is much harder than I thought. How do I know if I'm focusing on the right things? There's all these fires and there's embers, and which embers should I leave going, which shouldn't I? I have no clue. And by the way, that one was somebody who'd been in leadership for 4 years. That was not someone who just entered. I feel like I don't know what I'm doing. Leadership isn't what I expected. It's much harder. And I felt a sigh of relief, like, oh, it's not just me. But then I thought, oh no, this is a problem. Because if leaders feel this way, how are we going to create those great environments that I long to create? And by the way, what also most of them told me is that they went into leadership to create great environments, work environments. That's why they went into it. Very few told me I went in it for the money or the power. Very few on surveys I did. Most told me I want to create a better work environment. But then we feel like this. So, here's the thing. I want to talk to you today about some of the tools that I use. I'm not going to give you 1 or 2 tips on how to be a great leader, because the answer is there's not one size fits all in leadership. So I can't give you one answer. But what I am going to do is tell you about some of the tools I've used with the leaders over these years. I'm sorry if this is really loud. Some of the tools that I have used with leaders over the years. But first, I want to talk about why leaders feel lost. The first thing is we conflate management and leadership. Every week I read an article that says the headline has something about leaders, but then inside the article it's all about management. We don't recognize that they're different things. We conflate them all the time. You're probably aware of this, right? We say management and leadership often as they're interchangeable, but they're not. So I want to tell you about how I think about leadership and what I mean today. First of all, their role requires them to work across organizational lines. The second thing is, I'm talking about people with conferred titles, mostly because the mechanisms and expectations are different, but if you squint, we can apply it to all leaders. And by the way, please make no mistake, I don't mean this to be, it's not elitist. I think there are plenty of people who act as leaders who don't have conferred titles. It's just so that we have the same understanding and so that you know who I'm talking about right now. And the third thing I mean by that is it's not about managing the day-to-day work. That's what I mean by leader. We're going to talk a lot more about this. But we need to make sure that we're not conflating these two because we feel lost. We get into the role and we try to manage when what we need to do is lead. It really makes us lost. And here's the other point that's really important to me. When we conflate the two, we leave out a really important group of people. Leaders who do not manage. Not all leaders manage, and not all managers lead. Thank you, someone's nodding, thank you. You have gorgeous hair, by the way. It's really beautiful. Sorry to make everyone look, but it's great. But when you're right, not all leaders manage. So we have to stop conflating the two because we leave them out. And these folks already don't get enough support. You know who I'm talking about, right? My dad was one of these people. But it's in our environment now, staff engineers, principal engineers, distinguished engineers, advisors to the CTOs, sometimes CTOs. So we have to make sure that we're being clear about the language that they're using so that we do not omit this group. I'm sorry, I have a hairball today. And someone's taking a picture of me while I'm drinking water. I'm so sorry. I have no filter, can you tell? I'm just going to tell you what's going on inside my head. So I don't know if you guys know, Tanya Riley, The Staff Engineer's Path, right nods, fantastic book. This is my favorite chapter. You're a role model now. I'm sorry. It's my favorite chapter because it speaks to the challenges that those leaders face. And the problem is what happens with those IC leaders is they get into these roles where they have to do all these things like influence and get people on board and all the things I'm about to talk about, but we don't give them any support. We give them all of the technical, yes, some nods. We don't tell them all of the other stuff that surrounds the technical piece, which I would argue is just as big for senior IC leaders. And it's a real shame. And can you tell, like, I love my dad with every ounce of my being, so I'm still trying to change that work environment for him. And I have one of these in my own house, too. So I see the pain of this every day. But this book is an incredible book. If you want to go that senior IC path, read it. If you lead people who are on the senior IC path, read it. It's an incredible, incredible book. I interviewed her for the LeadDev Bookmarked series, if anyone knows that. I'm the host of that. Yeah, it's a great series. We're about to interview Laura Hogan on resilient management coming up. We've interviewed Camille Fournier. Her series, you can listen to her talk about this on that series. It's on YouTube. You can always find me, and I'll let you know about it. On the Bird app, you know, this name. So I want to talk about the next reason why we're lost. So our perceptions of leadership are shaped from afar. So how many of you have ever thought leadership was not that hard? How many of you have ever thought you could do a better job than the leaders? Yeah, I know. I'm like, come on, raise some hands. I'm raising my hand, too. When I was early in my career, I'll admit it, I'm embarrassed, but I'll tell you, I criticized them. I thought, that was so simple. How did they biff this decision? How did they mess this up? I thought it was simple. I thought leadership was simple. The reality is I was looking at it from afar. And then I got into more of a leadership role. And I thought, okay, well, so it's not simple, but maybe it's complicated, right? There's problems, but like there's steps you can take, right? Look at that maze. You can get out of that maze. There's a way out. I did not try it, so somebody at home will probably try this, but you can get out. You can find an answer. There's systems, there's algorithms, there's processes, there's rules, there's axioms. We can solve problems. We can control what's going on. We can get a measure of control. And then I got into bigger leadership roles, more responsibility, and I realized leadership isn't complicated. It's definitely not simple. It's complex. So complicated algorithms, processes, answers, control, complex, more unknowns, more uncertainty, more change, more interrelated parts. The answer often is, it depends. You heard me right? It depends. This is why I wanted to stick my head into a bag of potato chips that day. This makes decision-making harder. It makes it more difficult to know if you're doing a good job. Leadership is complex, not complicated. And when we don't understand that, that's why we're lost. Because we go into it, and every leader I've spoken to has said, it is so much harder than I thought. And I think it's largely this. I saw a post recently on LinkedIn. I see this frequently. Different posts about leadership. And someone said, so a high performer asked for a small raise, and the company didn't give it. And now they have to spend 4 times the amount to replace that person in recruiting costs. How dumb is that? How incompetent are they? There are lots of comments about that. I did read the comments. I read every single one of them. There were hundreds. Now listen, it might be true. It might be true that is, it was simply like they were penny wise and pound foolish, right? They cut off their nose to spite their face. But when I look at something like that, I think about the complexity that those leaders faced. I think there could be more to the answer than they're just incompetent, or they're making really poor decisions, or other answers were like, they're in their ego. They don't want people to make as much money as them. I mean, maybe. But I think about, well, what if that company has a value called fairness? And they're trying to level people up. And by doing that, they've said, we will not raise anybody's salary off cycle. We want to do it in a really measured way. Our salary bands are a mess, and so we need to think about that. We maybe folks who are overrepresented are already paid, and we want to bring up other folks. That could happen. What if that person, what does a star performer or a great performer mean? Is it just their shipping code? What's their impact on the culture? Maybe that person was not a positive influence, right? I can see a nod, thank you. I love it when people nod. I'm like, yes, you get it. So it's complex. It is not simple. And when we don't remember that, we get lost when we get in it, when we get in that role. So, so sorry for the hairballs. The third thing is that leadership is a transition. It's not like what we've been doing before. In our old world, before we get into leadership, we're moving goals forward. We're doing or managing the work. We have less autonomy. We're more following direction. Our focus is on our team or our area. We have known maps to guide us. I mean, look at this. It's very neat and orderly, right? We can just walk right down this path. Maybe there's some side notes, but generally, it's pretty neat and orderly. When we get into leadership, I mean, look at that. It's like we've been helicoptered onto a new terrain. I mean, there's a dense forest. Where's the path? Where's north? Where's the compass? It's like fog. I can't see a path. So our old maps don't work on this new terrain. When we become a leader, we have high pressure and more stakes with scrutiny. I always liken leadership to being constantly on a stage. I'm telling you right now, I do not want to be on the stage all the time. It's a lot of pressure. But that's how leaders operate. There's hard communication everywhere. Everywhere. And not just those performance conversations that we think about in hard conversations. Lots of conversations about goals and rewards that don't match up. And how do we get there? And differing ideas about how we get there. Shared decision-making. We share land now. Now we have to share decision-making. And we want more autonomy, but instead what we discover is that we actually have to make more decisions, and it can feel like making decision by committee. How fun is that? It's not. Guiding rather than managing. We have more power, but we don't really know what it means or how to use it. We don't understand how power dynamics really work. We don't understand that people, now that we have this title, people see us differently. We think, oh, just little old me. I'm just me. Like, I don't have any power. And by the way, leaders can also feel disempowered. That might surprise you, but leaders can absolutely feel disempowered, even though we think that they have all the power in the world. And this can lead them to not understand the power dynamics going on and the perception of other people. It shocked me too. People treated me like an authority figure or a parent sometimes, and I was like, me? Oh. It was a real awakening for me. We have to work at the organizational level. I think most importantly, those maps peter out. We don't have maps, right? Go forward, you've got career maps before this, you have feedback conversations. Hopefully you're having feedback conversations with your boss. You're having those reviews. But when you become a leader, most of that peters out. And that's not a diss on senior leaders at companies. They don't have the bandwidth and the time, mostly. Some do it, and I'm so happy for them. But we don't have the time and the space, and so leaders are dropped into this terrain and they have no idea how to navigate it. So how do we navigate the new terrain? How do we help leaders find themselves? Because when they're lost, we're lost. The first thing is that we have to talk about the real expectations of leadership. When we don't talk about it, we think about stereotypes, right? Leaders are strong, tough, decisive. Well, what happens if we don't fall into those? We just try to imitate that, right? If we don't talk about it, then we try to imitate that. But that looks weird and awkward. By the way, it also introduces bias about who gets to be a leader, what leaders look like. There's bias in our system when we don't talk about it. Leaders look all shapes and sizes. I cannot emphasize that enough. All shapes and sizes and styles. And when we don't talk about it, we miss that point. Be more leaderly. I know someone who was literally told early in their leadership journey, be more leaderly. And they said, well, what does that mean? And they said, I don't know. I'll know it when I see it. That's literally what they said. I mean, we can chuckle and we're like, has anyone else had that? I had someone literally say, I'm going to pull my ear when you're doing it. And I was like, what? They literally said, I'm going to pull my ear. And I said, well, I don't know. Am I scratching my nose? Am I talking too loud? But this is the kind of feedback that leaders get. Like, how confusing is that? It's, I guess you could say it's a guessing game. It's feedback without detail, without a way to improve. So what we need is a common language. We need some common language so we can begin to change this. And we need a map, right? Here's the terrain. Watch out for that lake. Here's where you can camp. You are here. So I've come up with a model of 7 competencies, things that I think leaders need in order to navigate the terrain. It's not the only answer. It's just my attempt to give us a common language to help leaders navigate the path so, again, we can create these better work environments. It's been I've worked on it. I've used it with hundreds of leaders, and by the way, it also works with senior IC leaders. So if you want to go that path, or you are a senior IC leader, this should apply for you as well. And if it doesn't, please come after me later and tell me, because I will update my model. All right, influence. We all know about this one, right? No one's surprised this one shows up. We talk about influence all the time, but like, what does that really mean? A new leader once told me, well, my boss says that influence is kissing up to people, telling them what they want to hear, because you never know when you might need a relationship. Well, they're right about you never know when you might need a relationship. But you can have influence without kissing up. Or the other one we say is like playing politics. You can have influence without doing that. So when I think about influence, I think about how do you bring others along without using positional authority? I'm your boss. I told you so. Because some of those things our parents said to us, but we also do as leaders. How do we influence people and get them to want to work with us without using positional authority? Are we able to adjust our communication by audience? Do we understand different audiences, and do we understand what keeps them up at night, what they need, what worries them? And we need to know how to drive alignment across the organization, a group of people across the organization. So when we can do these things, we don't need kissing up, fakery, and playing politics. This is a really important task, and when I work with, I do have a few, I've worked with a number of senior IC folks in my practice, and we work on this one all the time. All the time. It's a really important one that we don't share enough about. I'm really sorry for all of the throat clearing. All right, the next one. We need org awareness. We need to know how to operate at the organizational layer. So when we are early in our careers, what happens, right? We focus on our area, right? Engineering. And then we begin to marry up what we do up to the business, right? We think more about what the business needs. When we get into leadership, we are increasingly operating at the organizational layer, and people sometimes are like, oh yes, that is an entity. It's a third entity that we need to operate at. And by the way, it's a living, breathing thing. Organizations are constantly changing. People say the organization has changed. Well, you've just seen the results of it or a big change, but they're constantly moving and breathing. Have you ever tried to wrestle an octopus? I have not, but I think it would be pretty difficult. So, we have to think about three things when I think about org awareness. One, we have to know how to build those effective partnerships. We have to make time to build effective partnerships. And this is harder than a lot of people think because it takes a lot of time and effort. And people always say, well, I don't have any relationships with other people, but I don't know what to say to them. And we don't build the relationship until we need it. But it's hard to build those relationships because we're building relationships with people across the organization. Sales, marketing, customer support, product, people, operations, accounting. And maybe if you're in a really large company, people in your engineering org, but people you don't work with on a regular basis. But it's really important to build those. We have to know how to work across organizational boundaries because it's not enough as a leader to oh, my team won. My team got across the line. We completed our goal, but what about you? That's your problem. You can't say that as a leader anymore because there might be some CEOs in here who are not about to like what I'm about to say. The CEO isn't your boss when you're a leader. The business is your boss when you're the leader. Because we need to build the business so that people can continue to be employed, so that we can do all those wonderful benefits that we want to offer. So we have to get everybody across the line. We have to be able to work across those boundaries because it doesn't matter if we get across the line if sales can't sell it. And I'm not saying that you are responsible for sales. I'm just saying we have to understand that. And the third thing is we have to be able to think in systems. So we have to be able to see the impact across the organization. One of the things I see the most is rewards that are misaligned. Product and engineering is a big one where the rewards are misaligned. But we have to be able to understand how to work through that. And instead of, instead of being the poop umbrella, sorry, there's a lot of poop in my talk. Instead of being a poop umbrella, we have to think about who are we protecting is the whole company, the whole organization, not just our team. And that's a really big thing to shift. And if we are having to be a poop umbrella, that means that you need to do more work at the organizational layer so that you do not have to be them. So the stuff, so to speak, doesn't have to run downhill, so that those things get resolved at the right layer. So leaders, right, we need to do goals. We need to complete a lot of goals. We know that. But if we get there and everybody's exhausted and burnt out and hates work, I don't know that that's really success in my opinion. So we need to create a work environment. We need to guide that culture to create that work environment. And the first one I would say is we have to create an environment where people want to come to work. Do people have the Sunday scaries? That's kind of a problem. Now, maybe they're not in the right role, but I would argue that if you have more, multiple people having the Sunday scaries, you have a culture problem. You have to guide the culture. You might say, oh, well, but people don't leave companies, they leave managers. That's still a culture problem. Because why do you have a manager who is creating employees who have the Sunday scaries? That's a culture problem. This one, by the way, guiding culture is really difficult. Newer leaders will sometimes rank themselves really high on this one, and the folks who are the most experienced will go, oh no, I think this is really hard. I think I'm just middling at it, because they realize it's really difficult. We also have to know the kind of culture that we want to create to be intentional. Can we articulate what kind of culture we want to create? And to be intentional about when we want to shift it. The last thing is, to create an environment where we want to come to work, we have to foster belonging and inclusivity. Not just us versus them in sort of like departments, those kinds of things, but also race, gender, sexual orientation, ability, all those things. How do we foster belonging and inclusivity? And yes, it's about culture, but also there's been multiple studies, I'm sure you've seen them and you can Google them, that diverse work environments actually create better results. So it's really important for leaders to understand, how do I foster belonging and inclusivity? Do people feel like they belong here? Do they feel included? We need to be open and adaptable because, again, leadership is complex. There's all this ambiguity and uncertainty. And power dynamics and an outsized impact make this even more important. We can't manage this environment by being rigid. So the first one is we need to focus on growing rather than getting it right. We have to really be willing to make mistakes. Now, I'm sure a lot of people when they go into leadership go, yes, oh yes, I'm willing to make mistakes. I like mistakes, I grow there. How about making mistakes when you're on a stage, constantly, everybody watching you? It's really hard and you feel like you're disappointing people. I mean, I'm a recovering perfectionist. I will tell you this was hard for me. I will always be recovering, by the way. I will never get over it. But this was really hard for me. I hated making mistakes because I hated disappointing people. I hated not, that it had impact on people. Because when we make mistakes, people might lose jobs. People might have a really hard time. They might struggle with something. We might have an unintended impact on them. So this is what we have to do, though, if we want to be a leader. We have to know how to navigate change. So when we think about change management, what does everybody think about? Structures, right? People will come to me, I need to manage some change. I'm like, great. Here's my org chart. We think about the structures. What do the teams look like? Great, super important. I love a good org chart too. It's fun, right? It's kind of an interesting task. But that's only half the job at most. We need to figure out, how do we get people on board? How do we help people emotionally navigate the change? Because that's the harder part, because it means that all these things that they already have, friends change, who they work with changes, they're going into uncertainty. So we have to understand how to do that. A book that is really incredible on this, I'm sorry I don't have it on the slide, you can ask me later too, Transitions by William Bridges. It's an old text, but it is a seminal, incredible text about managing transitions. He talks about 3 phases of change, and he talks about the emotional journey that people have to go through in change. He also has a great version of it. I can't remember if it's managing change or managing transition, more on like an organizational business side. Highly, highly, highly recommend that book. And then the last thing is, we have to be responsive to feedback. Now, it's really interesting. When I teach workshops, I say to people, what's hardest about feedback? Ask leaders. And you know what they tell me almost invariably? I thought they would say, like, it's hard when someone has negative feedback. That's not what they say. What they tell me is, I don't get enough of it. I don't get enough feedback. Because remember, all those support systems got pulled out. You don't have career maps. You don't have reviews. Most of the time, if somebody gets a performance review as a leader, you know what happens next? We have mutually decided to part ways. I'm not saying everyone, I'm not saying all the time, but that happens a lot. So we have to figure out how to find feedback, because the feedback exists, but sometimes we think it looks like someone's going to sit me down and say, Susan, I have some feedback for you. Guess what? It rarely happens that way. Once in a while it does. Mostly it happens in these like cracks that we don't recognize. I've written more about this. There's a lot to say about all of this. I've written more about this, and you can find some of that stuff online, but really important. So we need to know how to manage ourselves. Focusing on others takes a lot of energy. So we need to know how to regulate our emotions so we can be aware of our impact on other people. I'm not saying be an automaton, but we have to know how to regulate those emotions. When we get irritated and we're like, ugh, just do it, we have more impact, right? Because we have this title. Other people see us as powerful, even if we see ourselves as little old me. We have to know, we have to be self-aware of our opinions, our judgments, and I just don't mean about things like race, gender, ability, sexual orientation. I also mean our opinions about how software gets built, how teams work, best practices, because we'll operate from them and assume that we're all on the same page, and that, we think that unless we do the work to understand what we're, have self-awareness, we think that we see the world the way it is. It's that great Anais Nin quote. We don't see the world the way it is, we see it the way we are. So we don't realize that those judgments and opinions are just that, judgments. We just think it's the truth. Wait, you don't agree with that? What? We also need to make time to think about what we're thinking about. So one tip, I will give a tip. If you are in a leadership role, and even if you want one and you're maybe not in one yet, take 30 minutes to an hour every single day just to think about what you're thinking about. No goals, no deliverables, just spend time letting your brain wander. Some people meditate. I'm not a meditator, I'm a moving meditator. So some people go and get coffee. They just go and they put their phone in their pocket and they walk and they go get a cup of coffee and back so that they can let their brain wander. I'm a journaler. I do morning pages, so I just write 3 pages every day. Yeah, morning pages. For those of you who don't know Julia Cameron, The Artist's Way, morning pages, you just write 3 pages of anything. You just write what's on your mind. You're not trying to get anywhere. You're just trying to get the stuff out of your head. And the third thing that we need to do is manage our time. How we spend our time, boundaries. When I put this one in the model, I thought, I don't know if this belongs in the model. Leaders should know how to do it. They're going to know how to do this already, right? And the funny thing is I heard leaders who were really experienced say, I used to be so good at this. I feel like I've slipped back. What happened? What happened to me? You became a leader. The landscape changed. I can see some nods. Thank you for the nods. By the way, I love the nods. They tell me that I'm getting in the right direction. Managing time is really hard because there's a lot of spinning plates, a lot of embers in the air. What do we pick? How do we have boundaries so that we can focus on the right things, so that we can also show up for meetings on time, right? Because when we don't show up on those one-on-ones late, we're like, no, I'm going to talk to the exec team. What are we telling the person who's late for? You're less important. What does that do to trust and safety? So, speaking of that, navigating humans. So navigating humans is part of everyday life in leadership. And if you are trying to get into leadership to get away from navigating humans, I'm sorry to say you're going to have a hard time. I'm really sorry, but you were going to have a hard time. Because leadership is not a solitary task. It isn't. So we can't do it on our own. We have to navigate humans. Again, even if you don't manage, you have to navigate humans. So the first one is we have to know how to create trust and psychological safety. So people will talk to us. They'll share their ideas, those interesting ideas that maybe they're like, I think this is maybe weird, but here's an idea. But if they don't feel like they're safe or they trust you, they won't. They have to tell you when I'm having a really hard time, I need help. They have to have trust and safety to do that. We have to cultivate talent and empower others. Rather than just doing it ourselves, a lot of senior ICs struggle with this one. I'm sorry. I don't mean to call you out, but they do. Other leaders do too. It's faster for me to do it myself, right? Or it's my chance to get into the code. So I want to get back into the code. Or, oh, this is too challenging for them. I'm putting too much on them. I don't want to put it on them. But people learn through challenge. So if you take everything, you're actually robbing them of an opportunity to grow. And again, every leader has to figure out how to do this. Whether you manage or not, every leader has to do this. I talk about this all the time with one of my senior ICs. Like, this topic comes up about once a month or so. So it happens for everybody. And the last one is we have to know how to handle conflict. I think a lot of times we look at leaders and we think, oh, they're so conflict aggressive and they're confrontational. But what I see is actually a lot of leaders who are pretty conflict avoidant. And by the time we talk about something, they'll say, it's been going on for 2 or 3 months, 4 months. No, 6 months at the most. I'm like, okay. How much have you talked about it? Oh, we talked about it once in passing. Okay. It's hard. But we have to understand how to have conflict, but also not only how to have conflict, but we have to know how to do what is known in relationship coaching as repair. So it actually comes from John Gottman, who wrote an incredible, okay, more nods, great, I love it. You all have read some great books. John Gottman writes about marriage, and he has a really incredible lab, and he's just incredible work on this. And the relationship training I went through borrowed his principles. And the principle that they borrowed in particular is what happens after a rupture? What's a rupture? Maybe we exchanged words in a meeting, or I said, I don't think you care about your job. Or I said it on Slack. What happens afterwards? Do we repair? Or do we just like... So anyway, how about that deliverable? What happens? It's hard to trust somebody. So do we know how to repair after a rupture? Can we say, oof, I lost it that day, I'm sorry. Or you know what? I'm frustrated, but I shouldn't have shared it in that meeting with 30 people. And if we can't do that, that person's going to lose trust, right? It goes back to the first one of this, which is we stop creating trust and psychological safety. And again, we're operating at the organizational layer. So if we miss somebody, it's tough. That person starts to recede from us, and it makes both of us have a harder time. Repair is really hard, by the way, because it means that we have to be vulnerable. We have to admit when we're wrong. We have to maybe put ourselves out there. They call them like repair attempts. And we have to hope that someone's going to take our repair attempt. In fact, I was actually just coaching somebody on this today. And they couldn't figure out how to get this repair attempt with somebody, and it finally was just somebody in senior leadership said, I'm sorry, you had a really hard time. That was a really bad experience, and the person literally started crying. Because they were like, thank you. And last, strategy and vision. How many of you are wondering, where is the strategy and vision? When is she going to talk about this one? This is the one that people come to me for workshops and coaching all the time. People will say, I don't know if I'm a good leader. I'm terrified of this. I don't know how to do this. I'm not a good leader. I'm not experienced at this. Strategy and vision is incredibly important. However, it is not the reason why most leaders fail or struggle on its own. It is not the reason. And there's plenty of work out there. Camille Fournier does a great talk on it. LeadDev has a great talk. Erica Stanley just did a great talk through LeadDev about some strategy stuff. There's great material out there that you can learn on it. It's important. But it's not the reason. The other reasons are why people struggle more and why they're lost. But the other second thing about that is that when we're doing strategy and vision, remember that organizational layer? We're not doing it on our own. And if we are doing it on our own, I'm not sure we're doing it quite right. You might do engineering, but then you got to make sure that you're marrying it with the other pieces of the business. So we have to know how to do business planning. How do we take what we're doing and marrying it up to the business? And again, not just what technology can do, but how does it fit into the rest of the plan? We have to know what are the priorities, what's the strategy, and what are the priorities that we're going to pick. We have 10 things we can do, but we all know if you have 10 priorities, what? You have no priorities, right? How do we know which ones to pick? How do we know where to focus our attention? And the last thing is we need to be able to translate the vision. We need to be able, of the company, that high-level soaring vision. We need to know how to get people to translate it so that people know how to execute on that vision. So these are the things that we need to do, right? We need to know how to get others along on the journey with us, how to work at the organizational level, how to be able to create culture where people feel like they belong, where they want to come to work and they don't have the Sunday scaries. We need to be able to adapt to a changing environment and continue to grow. We need to know how to manage ourselves, navigate humans, and be able to create a compelling strategy and vision to get people on board and coming along with us so we can create these really cool, innovative things the reason we came to the company. But is it enough on its own? No. Leaders need a support team, and this is where all of us come in. They need a support team to navigate the terrain and develop a new tool set. So there's 4 things that I think about, which is we need to be able to recognize the distinct skills that leaders need. So one thing you can do is stop talking about conflating management and leadership. Talk about leadership as its own discipline. The second thing is we need to talk about what does it mean to be a leader at this company? What are the expectations? I've given 7 competencies that I think leaders need, and then 3 sub-competencies underneath it. But I think it varies by the company. What do leaders need to be at this company? By the company stage of business, a startup is super different than a scaling startup, is super different than a business that's very mature. Right? What are we trying to accomplish? Who are the people on board? So we need to talk about what it means. So when you come into a leadership role, ask, what are the expectations of leaders at this company? What is expected of me? If you are a leader who has control of that, start setting that out. Come up with some principles and ideas about that. The third thing is I'd love to see more specific onboarding of leaders. Instead of just now a meeting shows up on your calendar, a new meeting, and then you're doing the listening tour, and now you're in. I mean, it's like being lost in the wilderness. I used to always talk about it as being dumped in the cold, dark end of the pool, deep end of the pool, and you're just swimming by yourself. Onboard our leaders. Develop a specific program for them. And last, let's create budgets. I'd love to see more budgets for leadership. I've seen those budgets. They're getting better, but they're pretty skimpy on leadership. There's a lot of when I do see budgets for learning and development in this kind of area, it's a lot of times it's management. We're doing leadership, and then it's all about one-on-one training for managers. And I'm like, okay, but that's not leadership. That's great for managers, but how are you supporting the people who need other skills, who are not managing? How do you support leaders who are managing but also have another set of skills? Create more budget for it. Ask for budget for it. Ask for budget for executive coaching. I'd love to see every leader have an executive coach. Conferences, workshops, leadership teams. I talked with somebody today who has a whole leadership boot camp at their company. Great idea. Figure out how to have a leadership boot camp at your company. Budget for that. That's how we can all help. And, the last thing is, I want you to imagine a world where leaders feel supported. They know what they're doing. They know what's expected of them. They feel supported. They feel able to make mistakes. They have budget for these things to develop themselves, to develop skills. Because when we can do that, then we can have those work environments that we all want. We all want a better work environment, right? Who wants a bad work environment? None of us. Not even leaders. They really don't. So I hope today I've gotten you on board with the idea that we need to care about leaders. We need to care about their experience, and we need them to get support. Because that's how we create that work environment that we all want. And also, selfishly, I want that for my dad, even though I can't time travel. Boy, I wish I had that time travel. I want that for my dad, and I want that for everybody else going forward. So, be kind to each other. This is where else to reach me. I forgot to say in the talk, I do a series with leaders, an interview series. I guess it's really a conversation series. I talk with leaders about a change or a challenge they've faced. It's not about like the theoretical idea about what leadership is. It is real leaders' lived experience. And I do it in part so that leaders feel less alone. I've interviewed all sorts of leaders. We've talked about what it's like to lead while having a chronic illness, i.e. incurable cancer. We talked about acquisitions, what it's like to build trust as a VP in a new company. First time, you've been at a company for 8 years and then you moved, and now what do? We're turning it into a podcast, a proper podcast in the coming year, but that's another great resource for you to hear stories about how did people navigate these challenges, and you'll see these themes show up. A couple of places to reach me. I am on the Bird app by my name for as long as it still exists. But, I'm more increasingly other places. So thank you so much for letting me talk to you about leadership today.